All right, so I've just finished reading Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, which is like the first book in kind of Alice type series by Lewis Carroll. And I think from a very modern perspective, this book has gotten way out of hand in the way that we just view it and interpret it. And I think what a lot of my generation's ideas of what the book are without ever reading the book, because there's one phrase that comes out of it, which is down the rabbit hole, which is first used in a term sense of just going and digging and finding every loose end and going down the rabbit hole of just kind of this endless cycle of new things. Which I think after reading this book still kind of makes sense. I'll talk about them more in a second. But the second envisionment that I think my generation very closely has with Alice's Adventures in Wonderland is the connection to drug usage. At least in my personal culture, that's like a very like common placement of what this book means. And I think it has a lot to do with the version that was made in, I think it was 2008 maybe. I think Johnny Depp's in it. Which is this kind of bright color but like off color type style. And usually I hear it in terms of mushrooms. I think is the most common one I hear or I associate with, and I think it's because there's a good section of this in which Alice does eat mushrooms in order to make herself either grow or shrink. But I think this envisionment of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland is just so far off base, and I think is very rooted in the 90s and 2000s vision of trying to make childhood and make innocence and make things that we look back on in nostalgia in some way, and make them in some way deviant. Yeah. But the book itself, I think it correlates a lot with the first saying that goes along with it, of going down the rabbit hole, because this is very much a segmented book. This is a book that, like, it is, I think it's 10 chapters, and it's like each one of these is like its own little tiny short story in of itself, and nothing really, it's very much a this happens and then this happens and then this happens and then this happens, right? There's nothing there that's very, that like in a normal story that we would think of is consequence heavy, right? Or is causality heavy. There's not a lot of that going on. It's just very it's A to C to R to Q, right? Nothing's very connected through all of this. And yet, within each one of these kind of short stories, there is a lot of consequence of actions, right? The one that comes to mind immediately is, I think it's chapter 2, maybe even chapter 3. That's like Alice drowning in a pool of her own tears, which is more or less a comment on not understanding the consequences or the down or the misplaced effects of your actions. Um, so yeah, but yeah, this book is just very, very segmented. You can tell that this is written for a child, um, because the story, Lewis Carroll makes for the Liddells. Alice is the middle daughter, um, and it feels very, very much like a short series of like bedtime tales that are all semi-connected because they all exist in this universe, but they're not. There doesn't seem to be any consequence between any of them. Each one of them has some sort of moral that you could possibly pull out of it, but even then, that idea gets made fun of, um, by the Duchess, where and the point of that is to say, well, not every story has a moral to it. Sometimes stories are just stories, and things are just things, and we don't have to try to pull anything out of it. I'm trying to think of what other fun things. I think the other popular interpretation of this book is it's a comment on how we grow up and we lose our imagination, and this is kind of a story of Alice growing up, right? And I think the envisionment of that is the fact that Alice is the only sane one in Wonderland. She is like the one person who tries to fully think through everything. She's the one person that's not constantly acting on immediate impulse. She's trying to logic her way through things, and eventually stands up for both herself and the knave, and that gets her killed in Wonderland, but she wakes up in the real world, right? And I can see that envisionment of this is kind of Alice growing up. But at the same time, the person who makes the observation, right, is not Alice herself. It is Alice's older sister that does. And Alice's older sister makes this kind of beautiful little scene in which the older sister will have children, and Alice will be there to entertain the children and to tell them stories and tell them wonderful, fantastical stories, right? And from that, I don't think it is much as a tale about growing up as it is a story about understanding the benefits and the usefulness of creativeness and imagination, right? I think that's the big thing here, right? It's just be proud of being creative and be proud of being imaginative, and don't let the fact that you are going to grow up take that away from you. Yeah, I really do think that's actually the big takeaway from Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Yeah, yeah. Anything else to talk about with this book? It has a very like Wizard of Oz type of deal, in which Alice wakes up from this dream and this envisioning of Wonderland, and Alice's older sister is kind of still hanging around. She sends Alice inside, and Alice's older sister is just hanging out outside, sitting and hearing all the things, and she's envisioning Wonderland as Alice has described it. And she's sitting there with her eyes closed and seeing the world as Alice saw it. And then she opens her eyes, and then she starts identifying where all these sounds are coming from. Where, like, the mock turtle's cries are actually the distant cow's moos. The clanking of the tea cups were actually sheep bells ringing in the distance. The queen is actually the shepherd boy yelling across all over the place, right? And so it has this very, very Wizard of Oz type idea in which, like, it's just like, oh well, it's all just a dream and about imagination, but then also it's the body taking in everything from the world around it, right? Which then I think just goes again to show how important the idea of imagination is in this book. But yeah, that is pretty much my thoughts on Alice in Wonderland. I don't think I have anything else to say about it. Yeah, I mean, it was enjoyable. It was fun. Yeah, yeah.